Do you ever feel like parenting is hard because your past trauma of abandonment or neglect has left you feeling empty or with little to give your family? My guest has been down that road and he's here to help, so don't go anywhere.
Welcome to the Fatherhood Challenge, a movement to awaken and inspire fathers everywhere to take great pride in their role and to challenge society to understand how important fathers are to the stability and culture of their family's environment. Now, here's your host, Jonathan Guerrero.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My guest is Don Stinson. Don is a podcast host, producer, and author. As a dad, he is passionate about inspiring fatherhood by turning challenges into connections. Don, thank you so much for being on the Fatherhood Challenge.
Jonathan, thanks so much for having me here. Happy to be here.
Don, I got to ask, what is your favorite dad joke?
I heard once somebody tell me that they once worked in a bubble gum factory and they got in trouble and their boss really chewed them out.
I love that one.
Yeah, little bait and switch sometimes.
So, Don, let's jump right to it. You grew up experiencing abandonment as a child. Would you please share that story with us?
Yeah, I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, and that's my hometown, Joliet. It's about an hour outside of Chicago. It's what a lot of people call a very blue collar community in some sense. There, we've just got everybody out there. And growing up, it was difficult for me because I had a mom and dad, but dad leaves when I'm about 3 years old, and that was just kind of a pattern he had in his life. And my mom tried to do the best that she could, but she had her own struggles. She had my brother when she was 15 years old, and then I had a couple sisters that she had in between, and then she had me when she was 40 years old from a separate marriage there. So, my mom, she grew up with her own abandonment and trauma issues as well, and those things were kind of carried through. So that's kind of the tough part is when you have dad leave when you're 3. Who fills that gap, right? And I had a stepfather that came in eventually, and he and I just kind of never clicked in that sense. But looking back, I realized how much that community of Joliet just came forward to help me out. And Jonathan, it was just so cool to think back about how many teachers and church leaders and coaches came out to help me out and in various ways. Sometimes it was they were kind of noticing we didn't have enough food, so I got some teachers sending me home with like a loaf of bread and some peanut butter. Other times I have teachers that just kind of understand maybe I'm needing some advice at some point in my life or recommendations for jobs. So that's kind of the short end of it there. To me, there's always that silver lining of like, hey, maybe dad wasn't there, but it was kind of cool to have these almost surrogate and substitute parents that came out that were just really concerned with making our community better and focusing on the kids in the community.
It's interesting. You had an experience of what I call surrogate dads in your life. How did they save you, and how important are they to every community?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that they came in to, help me through was number one, being observant. It's those things when you ever see a kid that's maybe wearing clothes that are a little bit too small for them, or maybe they're not as kind of clean or kept up as much as they should be. That's where some of these people came in. They were observant of that. Sometimes it was, talking to mom a little bit about those things. Other times it was, kind of politely speaking to me about maybe things I needed to do better, things that I needed to, take care of on my own. So there's that part where there's a little bit of that direct help. And that was more like elementary school. As I get older and my passions start to turn more towards music. I was a trumpet player in my high school band. That's where you start to get a little closer to people that, as a kid, you want to be like. right? So I wanted to be like my trumpet teacher, and I wanted to be like my high school band directors, and my junior high band directors, and other mentors in town. So in that sense, when you start to develop that relationship, sometimes, at a distance, as it should be, I think sometimes with teachers and students, um, it was interesting to see how that feedback could be more specific, right? So I started to get things from my high school band director about, hey, maybe we're focusing less on work outside of school right now. We know that you need money for this. Maybe we're focusing more on trumpet playing. Maybe if we're focusing more on, he would line me up for gigs. What does that mean? I know you're a musician as well, Jonathan. It meant like I went from making, at that point in the 90s, I think it was $6 an hour at a sandwich shop, to my high school band director setting me up teaching trumpet lessons that were like $15 a half an hour.
Oh,
And
wow.
and I kind of look back at that thing, right? And as a high schooler, you're like, cool, I'm more than doubled my, salary, quote unquote, here. But I remember looking back at those things, and it was a little more involved with that. He wanted me to get better at my craft. At the same time, he knew money was an issue. He knew that I had to contribute to the household, and had to actually help with some of the household debt at that point. So it's those fine little details of people that just come in and help. And then you understand some things. It's interesting when teachers open up. I had I talked about my father, where he left when I was 3, but I did see him again one time. And if I remember correctly, he was driving down the road in his van, and I was in another car, and I look over, and he kind of looks at me and then doesn't really say hi or anything. I think we locked eyes and knew who each other was, and then he just kind of kept driving. Right. So those are things that they kind of sit with you. But I'll never forget a high school English teacher that I had, Mike Riley. And we had these papers that were due, and it was really important for us to get these papers in on Monday, and they were going to be graded by Thursday or something. And Mr. Riley comes in on that Thursday and goes, "Hey, I didn't get your papers graded," and we're just rumbling a little this. And this is the first time I heard this from a man. And Mike Riley goes, it was my week with my boy. He was divorced. He goes, it was my week with my boy. He comes first. We had a chance for some extra time last night. So all your papers, they'll be graded later. I gotta, pay attention to my boy.
Wow.
And something, I think I heard that when I was 16 or 17. And, we stopped grumbling. We're like, oh, okay. And that was one of those pieces of information you get when you're 16 or 17, and it kind of has to sit, and it has to stew for a little bit. And then when you're in your 30s, all of a sudden, there's this little flashback to that. And that, was again, a piece of information I had early on, but that I wasn't able to use until much later. And it was something I'll always remember, when it comes to my own children, and when it comes to what really is the priority, right? We all have obligations. We all have things that we do have to get done. No one wants to get fired from their job because they're not performing. But there's also sometimes, those places where if you can make the choice, I know what choice I'm making then.
You and I actually had very similar experiences. So I'll back up to the whole surrogate father topic. I remember, and I was taking, yes, we were both musicians. We have that in common. After one of my piano lessons, I got ready to leave, and my piano teacher's husband came up to me and he asked me, when's the last time you've changed the oil on your car? And I couldn't remember, and I told him I couldn't remember. And he says, all right, well, it's time to get that done. And he said, here's what you need. So he made a list for me, and he says, get these things. After your next lesson, you're going to help me change the oil on my truck. And then after that, we're going to change the oil on your car. This led from there to being able to, and learning how to do tune-ups, learning how to do brake jobs, basic car care maintenance. So he filled that gap. He knew that was missing in my life, and he didn't make a big deal out of it. He just stepped in and filled that role. And so to this day, I've been very conscious about making sure my own two sons have those exact same skills and that they don't have to miss those experiences. The other thing was the poverty, growing up without a lot of money around, being short money for things like class functions that everyone else in my class seemed to be able to afford, but I couldn't. Well, uh, I had a cello teacher. I was also in the orchestra as well. I worked really, 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 really hard to get into the small group orchestra. It was more like a string quintet. Um, but I worked really, really hard to get there because only the best players could get into that group.
Yeah.
He was also very aware of the financial troubles that we had. So the director got me into that group. And on the weekends, we would play at weddings and funerals. Sometimes we would play at churches, and we would get paid for those gigs, and it was very, very good money. And I can't tell you how many times that saved me financially. And I was always grateful that he saw that need and he looked out for me. And it wasn't a handout. I had to really work to get into that group, but he made sure that that was recognized and gave me a good shot at it.
Yeah. So to hit on that point with, your own kids, I mean, that's where I often am, right? I try to go back to the first time I learned some things, like we all learned something for the first time at one point, right? I
Right.
don't I don't know when I learned to not put aluminum foil in the microwave, but I know not to. So there are those things, but it's all those other little life lessons. And I think about those things like, I don't know, coming to school and I remember I had a band director take me to the side and I think I was wearing like black shoes and a brown belt, but it happened to be one of those belts that had, brown on one side, black on the other. It was like a reversible one, right?
Right.
And he's like, "Hey, I have that same belt." He's like, a little life lesson. He's like, "Why don't you go to the bathroom and change this up? Your shoes should match your belt, right?" And I'm sure somebody out there in the fashion world is going to be like, "Actually, like whatever," right? But it's those so many of those little things that came from so many different areas. But you hit upon the work thing as well. Did you have this at all? Because I really learned how to work, and I learned that I could go make some money. Um, but it was fascinating because I started playing my trumpet in churches when I was 12, and I started mowing lawns before that, and I was working constantly. Um, and I remember when I hit my mid 30s, like I couldn't shut that off. Like it was just like I could not stop working because that is what I have spent most of my life doing. And I kind of had to make some choices, at that point to say like, listen, maybe the point of my life is not just to work. Maybe I can be a family member and a father and maybe even more useful to myself by like taking a little bit of this time off. But my gosh, that was hard to do, to stop that.
Yes, it's been instinctive. And there are times I wonder if, in some ways, maybe that has not been if it hasn't been a survival instinct just because of growing up really, really poor.
I had one of oh man, this was a difficult situation. When I graduated high school, my mom bought me a Gateway 2000 laptop, right?
I remember those.
Yeah, this was 2000, or sorry, 2002. And my parents, like they really, my mom and my stepdad, they really used their credit cards a lot, like really went deep into that. And I'll never forget how like heartbreaking this was for my mom. She was trying to do something nice for me, and she buys this laptop, and 6 months later she comes to me crying. She can't make the payments anymore. She has to hand the payments off to me. So now I have
Oh, wow.
that I can't take back, and she like, this was, they weren't cheap back then, it's not like you can get a Chromebook today for $100, right? And I remember being handed over with this like $2,000 debt. at that point. So, it's fascinating because those people we talked about, they came in so many different ways. I had a college band director that I would often speak with about finances. Just the way my parents operated, everything was credit cards, and it was a normal thing to have a car payment. And I remember him saying, like, dude, like, there's another way. Are you okay driving some like beater for a while? Like, yeah, I'm fine. I still drive one today. It's and
Yeah.
it was interesting with that, those type of things. Just again to hear that other way, and sometimes that information was contradicting what my mom would say. Because my mom's like, no, you have a car payment, you get the nicest car you can buy. That's a way of life. Then I hear somebody else saying, no, go buy something 10, 15 years old that you can pay cash with today. It will be fine. Right. So that's, just those things where you kind of get confused about it when you're younger. But the first time you try it out, it's like, all right, it's not that my parents were bad in some sense. This is just what, they were trying to do the best they could with what they knew. Unfortunately, sometimes what they knew just kind of kept them in that cycle.
I want to change direction a little bit. How does a dad who's experienced abandonment from a father begin healing to a point where he has something valuable to give his family?
To me, when I did it effectively, it was a giant sloppy mess. But it was necessary, So, there were those questions I had of like, hey, what was wrong with me? Why didn't he want me? Why wouldn't he come around? Is what my mom is saying is true, even though everybody else is like what they're saying does line up with, this picture that I'm getting of my dad. So there's that part. There's the questioning stage of it. And, for me, it was fascinating because I always had these questions about it. Eventually, I did get to that reality of like, he's gone, he's not coming back. This is what it is. And he was a very interesting character, my dad. Really loved his name. I posted about this recently on LinkedIn, but his name was Don. When he was married to my mom, they got a dog, a golden retriever, and they named him Donnie. A couple years later, I was born. They named me Don. So the dog gets, changed to Pups. And you read about it online. Like later on in my 30s, I found a brother. His name is Don, and it turned out to be the brother of my dad. And so this family tree is like a giant tumbleweed, right? But half brother from my dad and a different wife that he had. So there's that. But this was a guy that was always skirting the law. He was never paying child support. He worked for a water softener company. And at one point got drunk and sold the water softener van for more beer money. His boss bailed him out. Just really interesting, fascinating things, right? So to that point, you have those questions. You do have, for me, that point in my life where I had to work so hard to prove I wasn't him, and I thought I had to prove it to other people when they weren't really putting me in that position. It was me. But there came to be a point, I remember, where when I found my brother, and I have a sister in California as well, I reconnected with them, or connected with them, I should say, for the first time, and we spoke, and everyone was great, and it was just really fun. And I want to say about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a call from a number in town, and it's like this local assisted living apartment place. It's in like the worst part of town. And these people call and they say, is this Don Stinson? And I'm like, I'm from Joliet. So I'm like, well, who's asking? And they said, well, we looked up this number. It looks like you're related to one of our residents, Donald Stinson Sr., that just passed away. Is this your father? That was interesting. So a lot of that healing process looked like going to that apartment. At that point, they had taken his body away. But they said I could go to the apartment. I called them up. I'm like, I want to see it. So I went there. I get a key from the front office after showing my ID. They told me, they said, by the way, when you get up there, they said, why don't you rush up there and I want you to shut the door and lock it because your dad owed quite a few people money. He was like selling his prescription pills to them and whatever else. Okay,
Wow.
great. So I get up there, and I just spend time in this apartment. Um, and it's interesting when I talk about how messy it was. It's me sitting in this just awful apartment. He at that point was on oxygen, but I think he was still smoking and drinking a lot. We got a closet full of oxygen tanks. We've got cigarette butts everywhere. Place is dirty. Like, whatever. I sit down on this couch and I just have this conversation with myself. And I think saying a lot of those things out loud, to me about, like, hey, this is my past. Maybe, I came from you or you're a part of me, but like, I really do have the control to go forward and the control to be something different. And also, Jonathan, just that acceptance that like it is going to be harder for me. There might be some things I never release, but I can at least shorten the time that I get stuck in those places. And I think having that conversation in that apartment really did help me out, and it was, it was interesting to do that. I think it helped me release quite a few things, gave me permission to be myself and do what I needed to do, not to prove to somebody else or myself that I wasn't this guy, but just because this is what I want to do. So I was there for a bit. I was there for an hour and a half. There were a couple knocks on the door. I did not answer. I remember when I left that apartment, locked it up real quick. I heard a couple, hey, hey, and just ran to that stairwell and got out of there. But that's kind of where that, to me, that catalyst, was of just cool. Here's the next stage of your life.
I'm thinking about a lot of dads that may be in similar situations. So, this next question is really important. And that is, what role has forgiveness played in giving you that freedom to be at your best for your own family?
That hate and sadness and questioning, I mean, that, and confusion and hurt, like that just eats you up. And it just, it takes up so much real estate in your head, and it's, I've heard before, like, hey, forgive, but don't forget, and I understand that, but, it does take quite a bit of work to get to a place where your actions and your state of mind, aren't held up by anybody else. And I mean anybody else, and it's some hard work. To me, it's like I started with the little things. Like I wanted to get to a place where my actions were completely independent of the outcome. Right. So if I walked up to you today and I just gave you $20 as a gift and you said thank you, and then you took out a lighter and just burned that $20 in front of me, like, I don't care. I did my part. Right? That sounds a little bit like, wow, that's pretty extreme, right? But that was what I was trying to work towards, which is, I am here to give and to help out, and I'm not in it for the thank you. I'm not in it for, the appreciation or anything else, whether it's my family members or my students or people that I'm coaching. It's like this is what I do. And, so then it kind of goes a little deeper, right? Because now we're talking about somebody else's actions that, or inactions that have kind of made your life more difficult, right? So, there is part of it where I have to look at it and go, hey, I've gotten some really cool opportunities because I know how to work, right? I have gone through some significant challenges. So there is that part where I certainly appreciate that. I don't think I'd be where I am today without these challenges and without having to just really crawl through some things, but there's that other part too where the baggage comes in with it, right? So that's to me where the work kind of came in, where it's like, all right, if I'm going to be appreciative of what I got out of this, then that's really what I do have to focus on. I do have to recognize, yes, these things did have an effect. Cool. Like, I'm going to have to really dig deep and do some very, very difficult work. But, the other thing too, it's like, I look at my partner and I, we share 6 kids. Like, the reality is I don't really have time anymore to be an effective partner and parent and community member and have all of that stuff in my head. It takes away from what I'm meant to do and what I love to do.
How can dads learn more about what you're doing, get your books, or get help from you?
I'm pretty active on the LinkedIn platform now. So if they look me up on LinkedIn, Don Stinson, and if you look up just anything with Don Stinson Fatherhood, that stuff should come up there. My website, donstinson.net, I think is a good way to contact me as well. On there.
Just to make it easier, if you go to thefatherhoodchallenge.com, that's thefatherhoodchallenge.com. If you go to this episode, look right below the episode description. I will have all of the links that Don just mentioned posted there for your convenience. And Don, as we close, what is your challenge to dads listening now?
I want dads to go out and find another dad or guy to confide in and potentially vent to. I don't want guys just venting to their wives. I want guys to be there for each other, and I think that part is so important. Growing up and even now in my 40s, I have no problem calling someone up and essentially saying, "How do I parent?" I have this specific issue right now. I need help with it. This is what I have tried, right? I try to bring some people some solutions first that I tried and bounce some things off. But for me at least, I am finally at a point. I have absolutely no shame in asking for this help. And I think anyone out there that dam hasn't broken for you yet, I just try it. Find 2 or 3 people, even if it's like, hey, I just want to talk to another guy right now about some of these things. And I think you will be absolutely surprised, number one, how welcoming people are and how helpful they can be. And I think also, like, we're not alone. There are a lot of people going through the same things and celebrating the same things that we have and kind of trying to navigate the same stress that all of us have as well. So I think it's really just trying to build your own community.
Don, thank you so much for your wisdom that you've shared with me and shared with this audience. And thank you so much for being on the Fatherhood Challenge. It's been absolutely an honor having you.
I loved it. This was a lot of fun, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatherhood Challenge. If you would like to contact us, listen to other episodes, find any resource mentioned in this program, or find out more information about the Fatherhood Challenge, please visit thefatherhoodchallenge.com. That's thefatherhoodchallenge.com.
I'd like to pause and thank our proud sponsor of the Fatherhood Challenge, Zencastr. If you've thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcast production platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and distribute to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations. But the reason I personally use and trust them with the production of this syndicated radio program is their professional broadcast quality sound. There is no better time than now to start your podcast using Zencastr for all your needs. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code FATHERHOOD and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencastr paid plan. I want you to have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story.